My name is Ben Whisenhunt, and I'm a professor of history here at College of DuPage. Welcome to all of you to our panel discussion on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. A couple things I wanted to mention before we start is I wanted to thank Joan DiPiero, who's in the back, and our multimedia and our conference and event services folks for setting this up so quickly, because it's not easy to put these things together. And to welcome not only our audience here in the room, but also our audience apparently streaming live from far off places. So welcome to this. A little bit of a disclaimer is, you'll get what you get today because we put this together in about 4 days. So just bear with us a little bit. I'm going to read to you kind of some guidelines for us, just for courtesy's sake. This is a very sensitive subject for a lot of people. And so these are the guidelines that we're sort of going to practice as we have this discussion today. Is to communicate with courtesy and respect, is to treat others as you would in a face-to-face professional setting. You know, speak from the heart, also listen from the heart, challenge yourself to listen to others, be tolerant of other people's viewpoints, and to refrain from responding directly to a speaker. Not sure why we put that on there, but anyway, so we put that on there. So today we're going to have 3 perspectives to start with. We're going to have first Professor Joel Quam, who's a professor of geography here at College of DuPage, talk about some of the ethno-territorial realities of what the region we're talking about is. Then I will follow and talk mainly about President Vladimir Putin and what I think drives him. Keywords think on that. What I think drives him, not so much in the current moment, but also going back historically in his time in power. And then we'll follow up with Professor David Goldberg, who is a professor of political science, who will follow up talking about, to some extent, the EU, NATO, and multilateralism. So that's our panel for today. And then when we finish these, hopefully in about 45 minutes or so, when we finish this up, then we will have time for questions and answers. So if you want to ask a question, please wait until then. Also, when you want to answer a question, please wait for a microphone, because we are recording this and streaming it, and so we want to make sure you hear your question. Okay, so welcome. Thanks for coming. And without further ado, Professor Quam will start us off today.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm here to provide some geographic perspective on this issue, and I'm going to make a key point in suggesting that you need to understand some things about how the Soviet Union was to understand what's going on now. And some of you, I know, were not alive when the Soviet Union was going on, so that makes it a little harder. So let's remember that Russia is a huge place. Russia is much bigger than the United States. Russia is by far the largest country in the world by area. Not so by population, but by area. Okay, but the Soviet Union, the USSR, was even larger. Okay, some of us are old enough to remember seeing SSSR, or CCCP, it looked like to you, on Olympic jerseys. That would be Soyuz Sovietskих Socialistichnych Respublik, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union. Okay, so the Soviet Union was 8.6 million square miles. Okay, and all the colorful parts of the map here are the pieces of the Soviet Union. That broke up, and Russia became the main inheritor of that country. But all the pieces you just saw became countries. So Russia there is by far the biggest remnant of the Soviet Union, and of Russia, Siberia is by far the biggest piece. Nevertheless, the western side of Russia is where most of the action is going, most of the population, and most of what we want to talk about. So how do you govern a huge country? Well, you can't do it from one place. I mean, imagine if we tried to govern the United States only from Washington, D.C. It'd be crazy. We don't do that. We have 50 states. And within those 50 states, we have counties, and so on. Well, the Soviet Union had a somewhat different system of how to govern this huge country. First of all, they had 15 republics. That would be similar to the level of our states. We have 50 states, they had 15 republics. But a key difference is that those republics were based on ethnicity. They were based on the ethnicity of the populations there. So to be a republic, you had to be a major ethnic group of at least 1 million people. You had to be living on your ethnic homeland. You had to have an international border too, but that's sort of a bonus fact. So you had to be a major ethnic group to have this level of governance. Yes, the national level, Moscow was still the big player, but each of these republics had levels of autonomy and had governance going on. So when the Soviet Union broke up, all those 15 republics got what I call an upgrade and became countries. Okay? So those 15 there, including Russia, including Ukraine. However, there was a much more elaborate system of how to govern the country, because again, it's huge. So there were 15 republics, but there were also sub-levels of government, and the ones in red there are also ethnically based regions. So it depended on who lived there. Now that may seem odd in America. We didn't do that. We didn't create our states depending on who lived there. We didn't create our counties based on the ethnicity of who lived there. The only thing we have like that is our Native American reservations. Okay? But in the Soviet Union, the ones in red there were all ethnically based regions, and I've got them in hierarchical order there too. So at the bottom would be a fairly small ethnic group having a little bit of local autonomy. Don't have time today to tell you about my examples there, but all those are interesting examples of each of those categories. All right, the Soviet Union broke up, and Russia then inherited that system, that ethnically based system. So much so that Russia now has 22 republics within it. There were 15 in the Soviet Union, but now there's 22 in Russia. So many of those smaller levels got what I call upgrades to become republics. All right, so given that, what has Russia done? Well, you might not remember that this isn't the first thing Russia has done. In 2008, Russian troops went into South Ossetia and to Abkhazia. Both of those places are ethnically based regions in this system that I call ethnoterritorialism. But both of those places are in the country Georgia. Georgia was a republic. It got an upgrade and became a new country when the Soviet Union broke up. Abkhazia and South Ossetia, though, they would want what I call the double upgrade. They would like to bounce all the way up to country. Georgia says, well, no, you're part of Georgia, you're staying part of Georgia. But Russia says, based on ethnoterritorialism, maybe they should be their own countries. They're the majority ethnic group in their sub-region of Georgia. So, it's a longer story, but in 2008, yes, Russian troops went into Abkhazia and to South Ossetia. And there are still Russian troops there today. Russia, I think, would be fine if either of those became independent countries, but Russia would also be quite happy to have them join Russia. It's a little bit ironic because you see also there, but on the green side, on the Russian side of the border is Chechnya. Chechnya also sought the double upgrade, but in that case, Russia said, no, you're part of Russia and you're staying part of Russia, and had two little civil wars with Chechnya to make that happen. What else has Russia done? Well, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. Crimea, a peninsula on the southern end of Ukraine. This too is based on ethnoterritorialism in part, even though that was part of Ukraine. And Ukraine is clearly dominated by Ukrainians. Yet Russia in part claimed ethnoterritorialism in saying it needed to take over Crimea to protect the Russians living there. Well, yes, Crimea was majority Russian population. So there is logic to this, ethnoterritorial logic, saying, majority Russian should be part of Russia. And later in 2014, Russia started fighting in eastern Ukraine. Well, they didn't admit it for a long time, but they were supporting separatists more and more and more over the years. And this map shows you in the darker shadings where more Russian speakers are in Ukraine. And you can see Crimea in this bottom right-hand corner there. That's the peninsula of Crimea. You see it's darkly shaded in that, yes, a majority of the people there speak Russian, first of all, are Russians. And you see similar features on the eastern regions there of Ukraine. So especially in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine, Russia has been more and more and more fighting there to seek control or acquisition of those territories. So now, yes, Russia invaded Ukraine, and again, part of the explanation is ethnoterritorialism, saying that at least the eastern parts of Ukraine are majority Russian speakers and thus should be part of Russia. Well, now they've taken that a magnitude further, haven't they? And they seem to be wishing to take over all of Ukraine, citing various reasons for that, including that Ukrainians are similar to Russians. Well, there are ethnic, cultural, and linguistic similarities, but they're not exactly the same, no. So now, starting in the Donetsk and Lugansk region, Russia has moved in to try to take over, it looks like, all of Ukraine. But they've also come across from other places. Belarus, a very close ally of Russia, has supported starting points for Russian troops. So what will Russia do? Well, the first thing I think is they're not giving back Crimea. Crimea is a done deal, not going to go back to Ukraine. But what about Ukraine proper? I think there are three main possibilities here as to what will happen with Ukraine. One possibility is that Russia will succeed in this war and will take all of Ukraine and keep it. At the moment, that seems perhaps less likely because Russia has had quite a bit of difficulty in the war so far. It has not gone smoothly for them. I think Vladimir Putin underestimated how well his troops would do and underestimated the strength of the resistance from Ukrainians. And if Russia did succeed, probably very slowly, to take over the whole thing, how would they manage millions of Ukrainians who would be very hostile to their presence? It would be an ongoing challenge to maintain control. So perhaps instead, Russia, if they succeed in this war, will take all of Ukraine, but will install a different sort of government that sort of pretends to be Ukrainian, but basically does everything that Russia wants it to do. This is a possibility, and this makes some sense historically because what has triggered some of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine now, and what also helped trigger Russia's intervention in Crimea, was the sense that Ukraine was looking too far to the west, too far towards Europe, and really needed to be looking back to Russia. So an option would be to take all of Ukraine, put in a puppet government, and make sure Ukraine looks to Russia and not towards Europe. But the war's not going so well. So I think a third possibility is that Russia will simply annex the two provinces that have been the focal points of their actions since 2014, the Lugansk and Donetsk regions in eastern Ukraine, where most of the people are Russians, and that this will be a way for Putin to back out without too much humiliation. This does worry me, in fact, about the situation now. If Russia really loses the war and Putin looks stupid and humiliated, that's going to be very difficult for him to take as a dictator, very difficult on his ego. I think we need some way for him to save face. Okay? If he loses, how can he save face and save the Russian people? Well, we accomplished what we wanted. And this is what we wanted in the first place anyway. This would be one way of doing it. Maybe there are others, but this would be one way, saying, well, we really wanted to take these Russian territories anyway. But since this is not the first thing, this might not be the last thing either. Okay? It's not the first thing. In 2008, we saw Russia in Georgia. 2014, Crimea. 2022 now, all of Ukraine. But under ethnoterritorialism, there are more ideas possible. Northeastern Estonia, shown on this map, the same sort of map showing Russian population patterns where Russians are the majority, darker shades. The northeast corner there, especially around the city of Narva in Estonia, is predominantly Russian. Russia could argue the same sort of thing, that they need to take a piece of Estonia because of ethnoterritorialism, because it's Russian anyway. And Estonia was part of the Soviet Union, so we're just getting another piece of that back. This would be more complicated, though, because Estonia is in NATO. And the NATO charter says that if any of the countries in NATO are attacked, then all of NATO is supposed to be responding. All of NATO is obliged to fight back. This is not true about Ukraine, because Ukraine is not in NATO. That's made a tremendous difference. But I think it will also depend somewhat on how well this invasion of Ukraine happens for Russia. If it becomes a tremendous success, then they'll be motivated, I think, to go further. And they may look for a piece of Estonia. They may also then look for a piece of Latvia. Latvia, one of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, has a similar sort of circumstance. The southeastern corner of Latvia is predominantly Russian speakers. Russia could use the same ethnoterritorialism to claim that, yes, they should take that piece of Latvia. This, too, I think, depends on how this invasion succeeds well or not, but also is somewhat less likely because Latvia, too, is part of NATO. And this piece that I showed you actually borders Belarus and does not border Russia. So although it's Russian-speaking, taking it back to Russia wouldn't actually connect it with Russia. Russia could say, we'd like to have northern Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan, northern, also lots of Russian speakers. Russia could say, by this, we should take northern Kazakhstan. I think this, too, depends on how well this invasion works. If they really find it successful, motivated to do more, and maybe Kazakhstan would be that. Kazakhstan has many natural resources in these northern areas, and who could stop them on this one? Kazakhstan is in the middle of the Eurasian landmass. There's no coastal areas nearby. No, it's right in the middle. No one would be able to do much to help Kazakhstan if Russia really wanted to do this. Back to Georgia. I think this could happen either way. If Russia wins Ukraine well, I'm sure they'll be very happy to just chomp on Georgia and take these two bits as well. If Russia fails in Ukraine, I think this might be a way to save phase two by saying, well, at least we succeeded in Georgia, and go take pieces of Georgia, those two. Georgia right now is very definitely thinking, we better join NATO fast. Another piece that is quite obscure, but there's a piece called Transnistria. And Transnistria is on the western side of Ukraine, where it borders Moldova. Moldova is a small country that was also a piece of the Soviet Union. When Moldova got its upgrade to become country, well, Russians in an industrial area there called Transnistria didn't want to go along. And they're claiming that they should be an independent country too. Well, if Russia does take all of Ukraine up to the border of Moldova, I think it's a sure thing they'll just latch on and take Transnistria back also. And a little bit of ironic news, though. Now Japan is saying, well, if that's your attitude, you ought to give us back the Kuril Islands. Because right at the end of World War II, Russia took some of these islands, the Kuril Islands, and Japan has protested this ever since. And Japan and Russia have actually never officially ended World War II because of this. You're taking lands that you think you have right to? Well, what about these? These really should be, at least some of these should be part of Japan. So that would be curious if this invasion of Ukraine actually ends up losing them some of those islands. All right. Well, it's been 105 years now since the Russian Revolution and since that got the Soviet Union started. My argument today is that you can't understand what's going on with Russia unless you understand that the Soviet Union came forth and that Russia inherited quite a few things from the Soviet Union. And some of those are still lingering today, about 30 years later. One of those is environmental damage, another of those is population patterns, but for today, one of those is ethnoterritorialism. That Russia inherited the Soviet system based largely on who lives where determines who should be governed and how those regions should be governed. Today I'm wearing my Tsar vest for a couple of reasons. One is to remind you that that too was back in Russian history, but that now the leader Vladimir Putin is largely acting as if he is the Tsar. That Russian word that originally comes from Caesar. So the emperor, the king, the ruler. Okay? I'm wearing it also because it's my nickname, because it reflects my affinity for Russia. I think Russia is a fascinating place. I have fond memories of being in Russia, yet at the same time I cannot agree with Russia in this case. I think they're definitely doing the wrong thing. It's against international principles and people are dying. So as fond as I am a Russian, I can't go along with Putin on this one. All right, Putin acting as the Tsar, Putin as an inheritance from the Soviet days. Now I'm turning over to my colleague Ben Whisenhunt, who will tell us more about Vladimir Putin.
Thank you, Professor Quam. That was very informative, and something I think that's really critical to understand is to understand the place that we're studying, that we're looking at today. It's a complicated place, and someday we'll do a poll and see if anyone's actually ever heard of Transnistria before. But some people have. It comes up in the news again all of a sudden 30 years later as something to talk about, but it doesn't get much attention. But it's critically important in this moment, actually, because if you watch the news recently, if you watch the southern part of this invasion, President Putin is moving his forces to the west across the southern part of Ukraine, and that's where he's going. If you're trying to wonder why he's moving that direction, he wants to get to Transnistria, where there are Russian enclaves. So that's part of the game that's being played. So my part today is to try to pretend to know something about Vladimir Putin. And the reason why I say this is because Vladimir Putin came into prominence about 20 or so years ago. And when he came into prominence in Russia, he was somebody that nobody had ever really heard of. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about his background, and then a little bit about some key events in the past 20 years since he's been in power, and then some things that I call sort of Putin's brain. Sort of, we're trying to read the tea leaves. And the reason why he's important to understand is because I believe, my view is that he's very much sort of at the forefront of this moment. That I'm not sure where Russia is, but I know we kind of know where Putin is. And I think there's a difference in this moment. That's not always the case in Russia's history. Sometimes the country is very much with the leader, but I think we're kind of in a and a gray area at this moment about where Russians are, what Russians think, and as opposed to what Putin is doing. So I think there's kind of a moment of separation, but hopefully we'll get some clarity on somewhere down the road. So Vladimir Putin, just as a brief overview, he was born in Leningrad nearly 70 years ago this fall. And in being from Leningrad, which is today St. Petersburg, which, again, like Professor Quam, is a beautiful city. Russia's a beautiful place, and it's sad in many ways. Being from that city is very important in the Soviet mindset because it was a second city. It was a city that had once been the capital of the Russian Empire, but then it got a secondary sort of status. And people who come from that city during the Soviet times have a kind of second city sort of mentality. And Putin certainly exhibits this all the time, like his city was not the main city kind of idea. As we know, both of his parents survived fighting during the Second World War, which is quite a heroic event in the Soviet world and in his personal sort of view of the world. And he will go to Leningrad State University at the time, and then join the KGB as a young person in his 20s. We don't know a whole lot about what he did in the first 10 years of his time in the KGB. That's kind of by design. That's what it's called, KGB. Anyway, but we don't know. But we do know that by the 1980s, he ended up in Dresden in East Germany at the time that the Berlin Wall collapsed. And not long after the Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989, he quits the KGB. There's a joke in there, but he quits the KGB twice. He quit once in 1990, and then he quit again in 1991. They lost his paperwork the first time. It's actually true, but anyway. When that happens, then he returns to St. Petersburg, now this new city again, Leningrad being called St. Petersburg again, and he starts to work for a man named Anatoly Sobchak, who was one of his professors at Leningrad State University, who is now the mayor, the first sort of post-Soviet mayor of this city. And this is where two key terms up there that are meaningless, you can read them if you want. One's called the Committee for External Relations, the other one's called the Presidential Property Management Department. It's all gobbledygook, doesn't mean anything. The first one means that he worked in St. Petersburg for the mayor in redistribution of assets of the Soviet Empire, and then he moved on to the Yeltsin administration in Moscow and continued that work on a national scale. This is one of the most important parts of his life, is because this is where he was the guy sitting at the desk with the pens and the official purple stamps. It's a joke if you've ever been to Russia. Everything's a purple stamp. They stamp everything with a purple stamp. I have no idea why, but they're all purple, and they stamp a lot. And so he worked on these two committees, and this is where he was the guy who signed off on allocating the natural resources of the Soviet Union that were state-owned, owned by the government, into private hands. So he literally was the guy that made you, with stroke of a pen and purple stamps, a billionaire. He's the person that built the oligarchs, right? But he's no fool. Because as he was doing this, at the local level in St. Petersburg and then at the national level in Moscow, he took his own cut. So he basically built a fortress around himself to sort of who he was, right? He's going to become this kingmaker, and he's going to get his cut of all this. But you can imagine how much money you're talking about. You're talking about resources like metals and minerals and oil and natural gas. All these things now went into private hands almost immediately. And so he becomes really this kingmaker. Again, if you had been in Russia in 1995 or 1997, you never would have heard of him. Maybe if you're in high-level diplomatic context, but I've actually heard even high-level diplomats from that time say, we had no idea who he was. He was a guy kind of in the back of the room, and we just didn't know who he was. He was this sort of gray figure. But what happens then is he is one of the prosecutors of the two phases of the Chechen War. He sort of builds up this credibility among the Russian government. He's the person sort of behind that in some ways. And then he also will be sort of then brought into the presidential staff. And he starts to climb that ladder under Yeltsin. But you have to remember, under Yeltsin in the late 1990s, he was ill, he had heart surgery, and he was also sort of failing in popularity, and so Yeltsin was sort of looking for a way out. And so as Yeltsin's sort of failing in the late 90s, Putin is rising through these appointments, as you see from the presidential staff to the head of the FSB, and the FSB is the inheritor of the KGB under the new Open Russia. And then he also is the first deputy prime minister, and then eventually acting president and president of the country. But this is why we don't know much about him. It's because in those years, those late 90 years, when he was rising into prominence and clearly going to be somebody who's going to be on a national scale very soon, his biography was cleaned up. So his official biography was written, and there basically has been no sort of truly sort of academic or serious biography of Putin since. And this is because the information about him is not very well known. So that's why I call my presentation today sort of reading tea leaves, is because we're trying to read it from the outside. For people who study the Soviet Union, going back into the past, this was called Sovietology. We had to stand on the outside and look in and sort of peer in and say, what are they doing from like where they stand on a podium? And these sort of weird things that happened during the Soviet times. Putin in many ways is that person. He is somebody that we don't know a lot about from a very serious, either investigative journalist sort of way or an academic way. So what we have to do then is go to the main part here, and that is trace what his reactions are to things that happen. And so when you look at his 20 years in power, so he was president for 8 years, and then out of power he was prime minister for 4, and then back president again. In essence, he's been in power since 2000. Okay, and clearly, as Professor Quam said, he is, without question, he has built himself into a dictatorship. Also a very wealthy dictatorship, because you have to realize that in his skimming of money from those people in the 90s, that he has somewhere today, I read just this morning, somewhere between $75 billion and $200 billion in personal wealth. Okay, so when you see, he may be the richest man in the world, but we don't really know that. He has assets all around the world that I'm sure now are being sanctioned by the United States at some level, but I'm sure a lot of it is hidden in different ways and not being touched by whatever it is that the Western powers have done. But we will never, I'm not sure we'll ever know the answer to that question. So when you look at this series of events, it's important to sort of think about his reaction and the way he views the world and the way he views himself. So the first one is the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. It sounds like an outlier sort of event, like why would that matter to Vladimir Putin? First of all, he thought that was a grotesquely illegal event that the United States undertook based on lies. He says all this publicly. And he says that it was the United States basically acting as an imperial country, and you should never do this. There are ironies to some of this sometimes. Anyway, but that's not really the point. The point is, what happened to Saddam Hussein? Saddam Hussein was captured, I believe, by U.S. Military, and then he was put on trial by a new Iraqi government, put him on trial, and then he was executed. So Putin starts to talk about himself in that way back then. He starts to view himself in the Western eyes that would he be a leader that we would do that to, which in my view makes no sense. In my view, it's sort of almost a nonsensical sort of way to view. I don't think the United States or Western powers view him in the same way, mostly because he has nuclear weapons, but other reasons too. But that's so he starts to believe that the West is going to be able to sort of topple a sitting power if it sort of chooses to do so. Skip forward to 2004 in Ukraine, right? So Ukraine's not a new event in 2022. It's not a new event in 2014. It goes back to what was called these color revolutions back earlier in the 2000s, and this one is known as the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. They had a contested election. There was a pro-Russia candidate and a sort of reform candidate, and what you had was a very corrupted and sort of almost illegal sort of election take place, and you had people storm to the streets of the major cities in Ukraine, and they were able to take out the pro-Kremlin leader for at least 6 years or so. The man who was the opposition leader got poisoned, and his face was scarred from it. You may remember this or not. And that man will rule for about 6 years, but then in an election in 2010, Ukraine vote back in basically the pro-Russian leader. Yanukovych is the pro-Russian leader. So again, why is this important for Putin in the way he thinks? He truly believes that was completely instigated by the United States. That the United States, the CIA, was on the ground in force, prompting the Ukrainians to do this. Okay? And the question that always arises when I go to academic conferences, if you remember this event, is where did all the orange scarves come from? Because there were lots of orange scarves people wore during this Orange Revolution, and they wondered how Ukraine could make so many orange scarves so fast. And so it must be the CIA manufacturing plant. I don't know. 3 years later, in 2007, this is not comprehensive, by the way, this is just a sampling of events, okay? In 2007, the Munich Security Conference is held. It's held all the time. Nobody ever pays any attention to it. It's held just recently, and nobody cares. But he actually outlined his plan of what he's doing not only today in Ukraine, but also what he did in Georgia at this 2007 event. He says that this is a gathering of the lands. This is very much what Professor Quam just said, that he has a belief, a deep belief that Slavic lands, as he defines them, what Slavic lands are, should be gathered back. If this sounds familiar to you, something from the 1930s, it should. But he outlined his plan very clearly at the time, what he wanted to do with these Slavic territories across the world, his part of the world. But again, nobody really pays much attention to it, and he sort of proceeds on. And as Professor Quam said, he does eventually engage directly in Georgia the following year. But before that, there's an interesting part about Estonia. And you wonder why we think about Estonia as being so critical. Estonia is the smallest and perhaps the weakest of the NATO countries. I would guess that's probably the case, I'm guessing. But certainly a small country, maybe only 1.5 million people, borders Russia. But it also was attacked by Russia in 2007. And we didn't consider back in 2007 cyber attacks to be a breach of NATO protocol, but I think we might today. And so this was a very serious cyber attack that the Russians perpetrated on Estonia, which was a NATO member. And so there's some question of why the West didn't react to this, but it didn't, and sort of Estonia recovered and went on, and has not been physically invaded up to this point. But I agree with Professor Quam that Estonia is particularly vulnerable to perhaps Russian aggression. But in 2008, as Professor Quam described very, very well, the situation in Georgia was a significant one. South Ossetia was a big deal, taking that territory, and Abkhazia up to the north and the west of the country. 3 years later, in 2011, you have a situation in Libya. Again, it seems like a non sequitur, seems like an outlier in some ways, but as you may remember, in Libya, a longtime dictator of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, is taken out of power during this period of the Arab Spring. Putin looks at that again because he is actually a leader of a country for a long period of time who is also taken out of power and eventually executed. The word escaped me for a second. Anyway, eventually executed. And his was much more graphic, that there are scenes of him being dragged in the street. And so this is something that Putin starts to talk openly about in a public way, about how he sees himself as being a dictator dragged down the street kind of idea. And he sees this vision of himself being this person, right? Again, I don't think the West looks at him that way, but this is the way he perceives himself in this sort of world. Then we have these 2011 and 12 elections in Russia, not America, in Russia. And these are very complicated elections because the 2011 elections are for the parliament, or the Duma, as it's called in Russia, and then the 2012 election that will return him back to the presidency, from being prime minister back to the presidency. He repeatedly and endlessly will tell everybody that walks near him that the United States was involved in these elections, that there were Americans on the ground in Moscow campaigning against him for the parliamentary elections, for his party not to dominate the Duma, and for his own election in that year. That is something he harps on rather endlessly, that this is the West coming to get him and interfering in his elections directly. Okay. The same year, almost at the same time, in May of 2012, the United States Congress passed an act, a rare bipartisan unified act in our Congress in the past 20 years, called the Magnitsky Act. This is a very long, complicated story that I don't have time to tell you, but it has to do with a Russian lawyer who was killed or died in prison. You pick. He was killed and or died in prison, and the person he was representing was an Anglo-American, an American who also took on British citizenship, named Bill Browder. Yes, I was thinking of his grandfather's name in my head. So Earl Browder is his grandfather, who was the head of the Communist Party in America. Bill Browder is a hedge fund manager, kind of the opposite of a Communist Party member, and he actually was somebody who had invested heavily in Eastern Europe in the 1990s and early 2000s, and all of his wealth was basically sort of sucked away by the Russian government when Putin realigned the oligarchs in 2005. And he was one of these non-Russian or non-Slavic, non-Soviet oligarchs. So he lost everything, he tried to pursue it, and what happened is the United States passed this act. What's important about this act is it is sanctions, like we've seen more recently, like we saw in 14 and 15. And this act sanctioned directly oligarchs themselves. These are different kinds of sanctions than sanctioning the people of a country, and this is something that was quite innovative when it passed under the Obama administration. It was seen to be some of the toughest sanctions that the United States has ever levied on anyone, any country, actually, strangely enough. It got almost no attention, by the way. If you've never heard of it, it's okay, because nobody's ever heard of it. But it's actually a really big deal. Really sets Putin off, by the way. This is kind of a red line for him, because now he is personally affected and the people around him are personally affected. In those sanctions, people are named by name. It's not like just groups of people, it's actually names of people. They can't trade, they can't exchange money, they can't sell things in the world. And these are mainly oligarchs. Going forward, as Professor Quam already mentioned, we have the 2014-15 invasion of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. The Western reaction to this was somewhat muted in some ways compared to today. But again, it follows this pattern of acquiring the lands back in many ways, putting these Slavic lands back in order in the mind of Vladimir Putin. In 2015, again, kind of an outlier it seems, is that the Russians got heavily involved in Syria, in the civil war in Syria, and we watched that again on television like we watch lots of things, the horror of people being bombed rather indiscriminately, and also being forcing a refugee crisis. This is pretty clearly intentional, that what Putin was trying to do was force a refugee crisis. And the reason why he wanted to do this was to challenge Western institutions like the EU and NATO, which you'll hear more about in just a minute, to put pressure on them by sending all of these thousands and thousands of Syrian refugees into Europe. Because one of the things that sort of drives Putin is this idea that the West is this tolerant sort of Western place. And so his answer is, okay, I'll drive refugees into your territory and see what you do with them. In this case, they're Syrian. In the current case, we're talking about, at least as of today, probably around 2 million Ukrainians, right? And then the U.S. elections. This is something that is confirmed that he did interfere in the U.S. elections in 2016 in a variety of ways, more than people realize, probably. But he did interfere in the U.S. elections, primarily through social media. And this is primarily because there's lots of Russian investment in major American social media companies like Twitter and Facebook. And so this is why they've always been very slow to sort of reform themselves, is because they have heavy investments from Russian oligarchs in particular in these mediums, these platforms. And then, of course, in 2019, you have Ukrainian elections where you have Vladimir Zelensky elected to the presidency of Ukraine, and the complications that come with that. Okay. So the point of telling you all these events in a rather rapid way, really quickly, is that his mindset changes over time. When he first comes into power, Vladimir Putin is not necessarily as overtly and hostilely angry, anti-Western, but what it does is it builds over time. And it builds over time partly by his own perception and the events that have taken place over the past 20 years. So the last part of this for me, before we turn over to Professor Goldberg, is to sort of wonder what Putin's brain is doing. So what is it that makes him tick? One is he does want to restore the former Soviet borders. This is not an ideological question for him. This is not to restore communism in the world. He has really no interest in that. So when people hear that, they say, oh, he must want to restore communism. No, he has no interest in that. He is interested in the borderlands and it has to do with the 1990s in particular. So my first trip to Russia was in the 1990s, and I didn't realize how bad it was until I went back later. But it was awful in Russia in the 1990s. And this was partly, Putin will tell you, because of what Western powers told him to do, what told Russia to do, not him personally. And so he wants to restore these borders. NATO and EU are, to his mind, blatant attacks on him. He sees these as anti-Russian entities that are undermining him in a defense way with NATO and in an economic way with the EU. And we'll have more about that in a minute. He doesn't like that the United States dominates the world in global affairs. He just doesn't like it. He thought that Americans were triumphant in the 1990s, gleeful that they had destroyed the Soviet Union, and he resents that to this very day. He says this all the time. And he doesn't think the United States should call the shots in the world, and so he is trying very hard to align other countries against us in diplomatic, energy, financial ways. And so if you watch the news just today, I believe it was 2 countries, I forgot which ones, UAE and somebody else, wouldn't even take a phone call this morning from President Biden about oil. Well, why is that? Why wouldn't they even take a phone call from the President of the United States? Because the Russians are trying to undermine U.S. authority in the world, which may or may not be a good thing. It's just something that's actually happening. The Slavic homelands, though, is a deeper issue. So I kind of want to dig in this for like 2 seconds, and then I'll finish. And that is that Putin is somebody who is really an unusual person. And he dabbles in apocalyptic ideologies. So there's a man, the man on the screen. His name is Alexander Dugin. You've never heard of him, probably. He's in his 60s. He's kind of a fringe academic in Russia. And he has a very strong sort of apocalyptic view of what the Russian world, in conjunction with the West in particular, will look like. So the destruction of the West is sort of Dugin's thing. He thinks that the West should be destroyed in some way or another. And Putin and he have had an on-again, off-again relationship in this way. So you can't really link him necessarily to Dugin as somebody that directly advises him. However, Alexander Dugin in 1997 wrote a book about things like Ukraine and Georgia and lots of other things that seem to be coming true in the 20 years after this book was written. And so there's a very strong connection to this. And like Professor Quam, I'm sort of concerned about whether or not Putin's worldview will let us get out of this situation. He's never crossed the lines that he's crossed as he has, and that is a concern, because there's always this game in diplomacy of trying to save face and trying to sort of claim victory and walk away kind of concept. And he's crossed so many lines right now, it seems very problematic or seems very concerning whether or not there is a way back. And if you read in the thoughts of Dugin, if he is an influence, this is an apocalyptic ideology. This is an apocalyptic sort of, we have to go to the ends to make it, sort of win or die kind of concept. And that's a very frightening reality. Like I said, Dugin and Putin don't necessarily have a direct connection, but if you look at that book from 1997, in the past 25 years, there's a remarkable pattern of consistency in what Dugin laid out in 1997 and what Putin has actually done. And so that's my part of it. And so we will now turn it over to Professor Goldberg to try to find an answer to this question, and it's totally on him to do it, so I challenge him to do it.
I don't know. I think so. Yeah. I think
He just told me that Luxembourg is the smallest NATO country.
I'm not sure. It's just a guess. I don't know. So let me first of all just echo Professor Whisenhunt's initial comments. Thank you all for showing up on behalf of students and faculty, colleagues, employees, and people that are watching from at home and abroad who are hopefully participating in this. We appreciate your participation in this timely and relevant issue. I also want to thank again Joan DiPiero, who's very helpful and always willing to do what needs to be done to make these things happen, as well as the great folks at Conference and Event Services, who also make our jobs really easy, saying, hey, we want to have a panel discussion about stuff, can you help us? And everyone just kind of jumps into place. And so we really appreciate that and don't take that for granted, not for a minute. So I want to talk a little bit about things from a more of an international perspective. And so by that I mean there's sort of two broad themes, broad trends that are kind of in play lately. And by that I mean since 2015 essentially. You see the assertion of like nationalism and populism across the world. So in some of my classes I talk about this in terms of places like the Philippines. Clearly Russia's at the center of this, or not really the center, but is a big player in this. But also in places like Brazil and Hungary, right? So Viktor Orban is a person who we're somewhat surprised he's changing his tune on this. So why am I telling you this about the assertion of nationalism and populism? Because I think before that, there was a kind of a conventional wisdom in the West among many mainstream academics and journalists about globalization or transnationalism, that states mattered less, and that the power of the market and the power of technology were sort of bringing everybody together, making the world a smaller place, and this seemed to be a train that had left the station, that no one was really driving that train, but it was moving quickly on the tracks, and it was going to make the world a better place. So it's this sort of like boundless optimism about the direction of things. And sometime around 2015, roughly, when the UK, a majority of UK citizens vote to leave the European Union, people began to scratch their heads and say, what's going on? Why would a country like England, even though the UK has had a unique relationship with its European identity and with the European Union, people were surprised by that. I think people in the United Kingdom were surprised by that. So the fact that we see elections and non-democratic mechanisms of people coming to power in some of the countries that I mentioned earlier is part of the title here, right? About Putin represents, as Professor Whisenhunt eloquently stated, that part of what President Putin is doing is pushing back at these Western institutions, which you see in a couple of these different slide presentations about the European Union, but also NATO. There are other organizations, of course, but these seem to be in the centerpiece of these discussions today. So I'm curious as to whether or not this push towards nationalism and populism has sort of peaked or surged, and whether what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, prematurely so, I think is a push towards more multilateralism among some of these actors. And what does this mean in practice? And then where can we go? Where can we think about that in the coming next several steps that some of my esteemed colleagues have already talked about? And I also wanted to say at the beginning what a wonderful pleasure it is to be on the stage working with Professor Whisenhunt and Professor Quam, talking about things that we have a shared interest that I think are in the interest of the college community. So appreciate that. So I want to talk about the Russian invasion in broader context. I think as Professor Whisenhunt referenced, and this shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise, is that I think part of what President Putin's been doing for a long time is criticizing, calling into question would be a softer way to put it. A tougher way to put it would be consciously undermining these Western institutions that are designed towards collaboration and multilateralism. That he sees these as a threat to Russia. He's not the only one. Of course, there are other institutions and other nation states that do this. But President Putin's been particularly successful in the specific circumstances that my colleagues have mentioned. So he's invested in this. He's been invested in this because he doesn't see those institutions and what they represent as in his interest. And in a broader sense, in terms of Russia's interest, in terms of Slavic history, in terms of this bifurcation between the West and the East and where people are going to go and what they're going to look at and which countries are going to identify more with the EU. And this obviously is at the forefront of part of this current situation in terms of Ukraine and the division between the East and the West in that way. I think it's worth saying explicitly that President Putin feels very threatened by the expansion of the European Union. So NATO is getting a lot of attention, and rightfully so. And I think the security piece is important. The expansion of NATO since the fall of the Soviet Union, the countries that have joined in, the Baltic republics, and Poland, as well as a bunch of others that were part of the Warsaw Pact or at a minimum allied with the Soviet Union, who subsequently joined NATO, a security alliance that was created in 1949, in which was mentioned the collective security provision of Article 5 of the Charter that basically says an attack against one is an attack against all. So this begs the question, and I think this is a legitimate question that should not be interpreted as providing a tremendous amount of credence to arguments that are emanating from Moscow, is how do organizations like NATO continue to justify their existence in the absence of the threat that created their existence in the first place? I think NATO, and to a certain extent the CIA, have been successful with a lot of help in terms of repositioning themselves, be it in a post-9/11 environment, in Afghanistan and in other places where they've expanded and become more relevant. So there's that security piece which is getting a lot of traction among some of the chattering classes about explaining what's going on. And I think that there's a piece of that, but it certainly does not explain the variation, to my mind, in terms of the enormity of what we've seen take place in the last 2 weeks. I think the EU and the commercial ties, and in this sense, I might beg deference to Professor Matrani, also in the history department, and say that economics, to me, trumps security in the broader sense here. I think that more of this can be explained by the expansion of markets and what the European Union represents. They go hand in glove, right, in terms of what NATO represents and what the EU do, even though they're not entirely overlapping. But I think the expansion of the EU and what we've seen there is very much a threat as well. We've not talked a lot about, nor is it my intention to talk about energy relations between Russia and Germany and what that's meant. But clearly there are European countries, Germany being one of them, that rely a lot on oil and natural gas that's coming from Russia. So some of these pieces, I think, are a bit underdeveloped in terms of some of the conversations that are taking place cable and your social media feeds, perhaps. I think these two institutions have to be understood and what they wish to accomplish in the context of this assertion of nationalism and populism that's been occurring around the world, but certainly in Europe, more or less since 2015. So I think I'm particularly interested in what's happened in Hungary with Viktor Orban, who I've mentioned, who in the aftermath of the Arab Spring and the start of the Syrian civil war, 2010, 2011, when you see literally millions of people fleeing unrest, instability, violence in the Middle East, that Hungary is one. This is very divisive for the European Union because the existence of the EU is in part to welcome refugees. people that are fleeing this kind of unrest. I mean, that is the ashes upon which the EU was built in the aftermath of the carnage of World War II. So it was quite surprising when Hungary, in particular, became what was euphemistically known as, or not euphemistically, Fortress Hungary. Took a very hard line in terms of representing and accepting refugees. This was in sharp contrast to what Chancellor Angela Merkel was doing in Germany at the time, where she was welcoming with open arms, perhaps addressing some long-standing karmic debt on behalf of Germany, encouraging people and welcoming them to come to Germany. In contrast, I think Hungary had a very different perspective in terms of literally raising fences and making it very, very difficult for people who were fleeing what was going on in the Middle East and trying to get to Europe to make that more difficult, if not impossible. Why is that important today? Well, it's important because Hungary has changed that position, at least temporarily, right? So Hungary and Poland have been at the forefront of accepting people fleeing the conflict in Ukraine. And that is, the numbers are huge. I think 2 million was the number that was mentioned. 1.5 million is another one that I've heard. So a lot of people are fleeing unrest, and that's going to mean a continued humanitarian crisis that we're literally witnessing moment to moment. So I wonder if there's a shift. Is this just a self-serving shift on behalf of a country like Hungary and the populist nationalist sort of dominance in terms of that rhetoric? And I don't know the answer to that. Was this, the original policy was driven by the response to the Syrian civil war? This is the result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It'd be interesting to see kind of where this goes, because I don't know what the aftermath of this is. In other words, part of what I'm talking about is the context, not necessarily the day-to-day military operations of what's unfolding, but rather what this means for Europe, what this means for the world, and what this means for these international organizations. So, lots of small font, too many characters on one PowerPoint slide. The death of PowerPoint slides from you, the perspective of students, right? Well, I think there are a couple of pieces that are worthy of attention. Because we do see, I would say, at least in the short term, a kind of unprecedented level of cooperation across institutions, state actors, non-state actors, private capital, NGOs, and then, of course, the institutions that I've been talking about. So the fact that the European Union Defense Minister has approved 500 million euros, that's a lot of money, in arms and assistance is not insignificant. This is the first time, to my knowledge, as I understand it, that the European Union is financing weapons procurement, weapons sales, to provide to a non-NATO country. That's a big deal. That's a very big deal if we think about what the EU is doing here and why the EU feels as threatened about this as any NATO state. The International Criminal Court, which was created in 1998 to hold individuals accountable for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, that has had kind of a rocky history in the past 24 years. The International Criminal Court is closely monitoring what's going on because it seems that there's grounds for them to open an investigation to look at war crimes. We've seen things like cluster bombs, munitions that are prohibited by international law, not to mention Chernobyl, the miniseries, and what happened in terms of the nuclear reactor, right? So there's a couple different pieces of this that may grab the attention of the International Criminal Court, which I think is very interesting because this would be the highest profile investigation and potential taking it further than investigation. I'll just leave it like that. I think what Professor Whisenhunt mentioned that is important in this is how does this impact like the calculations for Moscow in terms of what Putin is thinking? So there are those that are celebrating the ICC investigation, which I'm somewhat sympathetic to. On the other hand, does this make it more difficult, as my colleagues have suggested, for Moscow to save face? Right? It's much more difficult to walk away if, in fact, there's a pending criminal investigation before an international organization that would potentially put political and military leaders in the docket in The Hague. Wow, that's a big deal. So while it is the responsibility of the ICC to investigate these kinds of actions, if you're a diplomat in fill in the blank from 200 countries who have an interest in resolving this, they might think twice about the ICC investigation. But I'm just curious to see how this is going to be playing out. On Sunday talk show, Secretary of State Blinken announced that the United States will be providing to Poland F-16 fighter jets to replace Polish MiG fighter jets that would then go to Ukraine. That's a big deal. That is quite it's quite significant if, in fact, it unfolds the way it's been explained so far. Now, again, that was Sunday, and today is Wednesday, so things are moving so quickly. I don't think it's my intent to try to capture, like, second to second what's going on. So if there's anything that I put up here that seems outdated or the information has changed, I beg your forgiveness, right? I think in terms of the EU, President Macron of France, who is up for re-election in April, against a backdrop of an underlining populist nationalist message from his National Front. They're not called that anymore, but Marine Le Pen's candidacy. She's a skeptic. She's a Eurosceptic of France's continued role in the monetary union and some other things. I mention this because Macron has been, in particular, engaging in shuttle diplomacy, right? He went to Moscow before the conflict started. He's been on the phone with President Putin, and he has been very much trying to work the diplomatic angle, which is important because that's something that other countries, perhaps Washington, D.C., might not have that same option available to sit down and have those kinds of regular conversations with leadership in Moscow. So that's interesting, both for the domestic context, political context of elections in April in France, but also because this is consistent with what Macron has done, I think. And it's consistent with the fact that some countries have a better relationship with Moscow than others. I think the NATO piece has already been discussed in terms of the Baltic states. I mean, the key thing here, if I'm not being too repetitive, is to say that if a NATO state is attacked, then that's an entirely different ballgame than what we're dealing with. And I'm not minimizing the suffering and the crisis of humanity that's unfolding before our eyes. But I would say, if in fact, so that's not Belarus, that could be Baltic states, Poland, or a bunch of other countries. If, in fact, this spills over, and it's worth mentioning that wars rarely stay in the boundaries and borders of the countries in which the aggressor state might intend. So if, in fact, that occurs, and that's an entirely different calculus for Washington, D.C., for Brussels, where NATO and the EU are headquartered, as well as all these other capitals, because they have a responsibility then. That's what collective security means. If one member is attacked, then everyone's attacked, and they have to come to their defense. So I think it's premature when people ask about, is this World War III? I don't think so. This is not World War III. But there is a potential for this to escalate in a way that would profoundly impact our lives beyond what you're paying at the gas pump this morning. As I said before, I think Hungary and Poland should be praised for what they're doing. They should be praised for taking this leadership role. That doesn't minimize this sort of other currents of things that I've been sort of alluding to, but I think that it's worth mentioning that these countries have, on a dime, as have others, sort of moved to address the crisis in a way that, as you've probably heard ad infinitum, that there's not been a ground war in the European continent. I'm not excluding the collapse of the former Yugoslavia and what happened in the 1990s. But the fact that this has not really happened this way in 1945 is a test of these institutions, a test of the leadership on all sides, from Moscow to Paris and everything in between, that is worth mentioning to see, well, what's going to happen next? I also just want to mention here, and then I promise we'll be moving towards the end of my comments, these other actors. So I focus primarily on international organizations and national governments with the EU and NATO almost exclusively, but I think that there are other things that are involved here beyond the ICC, beyond the UN. Sanctions, and I think that the more precise sanctions that the Magnitsky Act that Professor Whisenhunt referenced are important. That sanctions can be better than they were. Many moons ago when I was in graduate school studying this, there was not a lot of support for sanctions. There was sort of like, almost like an empty gesture. I think that's changed. I think the ability to have much more precise sanctions can potentially have an impact. I mean, that's not a universal fit. Some are better than others. Doesn't mean they all do the same thing everywhere. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I do think that sanctions can be more effective. And so that is a tool that should not be dismissed from the perspective of the casual observer. I think we hear about an embargo against oil and natural gas coming from Russia, from the White House. I'm curious to see where that's going to go, what that's going to look like in terms of will production quotas from OPEC member states and others increase as a result. Obviously, this has a kind of inelasticity of demand when it comes to oil, so we're all, unless you and I are prepared to walk and ride our bikes to school and work, are going to continue to find a way to work these increased prices into our system. Now, what does that mean? Well, if supply goes down and demand is the same, then that means more money for the oil that Russia is able to sell, as well as OPEC states and others, oil exporters. So I think that that's not a one-to-one kind of correlation that's going to move in that direction. I think the other thing that I've sort of been surprised by is how, and I mentioned FIFA here, there are certainly others, as a world sporting event for soccer has already said that the World Cup's out of bounds this summer for Russia. Will that change? Of course, all of this can change. Some of the sanctions, some of the actions that states and organizations have taken can all be reviewed in the event that the facts on the ground change. But I think that that's significant because it hurts the soft power of states like Russia, who just held the Winter Olympics not that long ago, want to be seen as world leaders. Well, if you're not able to participate in international sporting events that get bigger and bigger and more eyeballs on screens, that's not insignificant. So I'd be curious to see how other international organizations like this, NGOs, are going to be dealing with this. And then I mentioned some corporations here. I saw from a news network all the corporations that have begun to take some action. I think that's interesting because at times private capital has often been immune from these issues around human rights or conflict. The sort of stockholder concerns can trump these other humanitarian or questions of international law. So while I think there's some reason for preliminary optimism that Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Visa, Apple, and a million others have chosen to limit or suspend operations domestically within Russia, I'd be curious to see how long that's going to last. Is that going to hurt Apple? And I have no idea. I'm just picking Apple. We could pick Jeff Bezos. We could pick lots of other companies as well. Will they be adversely impacted in their bottom line 6 months from now or 2 months from now? Will they maintain the same position? Because it's I guess part of what I'm pushing towards is that all of these organizations are pushing in a similar direction, whether we're talking about the EU and NATO, whether we're talking about national governments in Hungary and in Poland, whether we're talking about transnational corporations that have billions of dollars in capital at their disposal, that are all seem to be pushing in the same direction. What I really sort of want to begin to move towards is closer to the end. Because some of the other bullet points that are on here are things that I've already discussed in a variety of capacities. So, the role of the EU and the US, I think, has been covered by the three of us sufficiently. I mentioned Hungary, I mentioned Poland. So that takes me to the last point about the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. India and China have abstained from Security Council resolutions. And that makes sense from their perspective. They have either direct relations with China that they do not wish to, with Russia that they do not wish to put in jeopardy. India has a long-standing security and other relationships with Russia, in part because Russia is a countervailing force to Chinese aggression. So it makes perfect sense that India would want to back Russia on this. The Emiratis are in sort of complicated situations as well. So it's very interesting to understand why Security Council resolutions, why states either abstain or veto, and the language itself that's included in those resolutions, what can get passed or what gets vetoed by the permanent five, a single member of the permanent five within the Security Council. China has said that they do not wish to play a negotiations sort of role in this, as has UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who initially was very hands-off about this and now has become a bit more supportive of a stronger role for people like Macron and others in the Security Council. So how this is changing, literally unfolding day after day, I think is interesting to sort of watch. How countries are recalibrating this as they're dealing with their own issues, either about trade relations, commercial ties, energy concerns, or security concerns, as is the case in India. How that they can try to balance competing interests on a day-to-day basis, but also long-term relations, because India's role in terms of a non-aligned movement in the past, some of this stuff goes back to the Cold War and before, to start and end sort of with the Soviet influence in terms of this. When we think about Russia's role in supporting Bashar al-Assad in the Syrian civil war, that makes perfect sense because Russia has a warm water port in the Mediterranean. If you're Vladimir Putin, you don't want to give that up. And supporting Syria and supporting Iran at a time when the United States and some of its allies are playing less of a role in the Middle East. This is calculated, right? So when people talk about President Putin being not a rational actor, they're not using that in the same way that we typically use that in political science, because I think these behaviors make perfect sense from his perspective in terms of what it is that he's doing. Now, back to the end of the story about saving face. How is there a way that the actors can walk away and maintain power? I think Professor Quam laid out some really good sort of decision tree stuff at the beginning of what this might look like, because installing a puppet Moscow-friendly government probably would lead to some kind of an insurgency among the growing number of Ukrainian civilians that are very well armed, it would appear, from media accounts, right? I think at a broadest sense, my comments and my interests are about this tension between multilateralism and the rise of nationalism and populism. So again, thank you everybody for showing up and participating, and I think we want to take questions. And again, I appreciate my colleagues' willingness to put this together on the fly and speak so eloquently about an issue that affects everybody. So, anybody that wants to raise their hand can.
So we'll take questions, and it's best if we have a microphone. So maybe let's start here in the front, try to move back a little bit. So when we start here and then try to move back quickly, because I know we went a little over our time. So right here.
Do you want to
Go ahead. You can stand up or just use the microphone. It's fine.
Thank you very much. I'm a student here. My name is Rafat. And thank you for the excellent presentation. It was eye-opening. So I'm going to just quickly just read an excerpt from John Merschmeyer's talk that he gave in 2015.
Okay.
And he said, and I'd like your comment on that, according to the prevailing wisdom in the West, the Ukraine crisis can be blamed almost entirely on Russian aggression. Russian President Vladimir Putin, the argument goes, annexed Crimea out of a long-standing desire to resuscitate the Soviet Empire. He may eventually go after the rest of Ukraine as well as the countries in Western Europe. In this view, the ouster of Ukrainian President Viktor, his name is kind of hard, it was an older former president, in February 2014 merely provided a pretext for Putin's decision to order Russian forces to seize part of Ukraine. But this account is wrong. The United States and its European allies share most of the responsibility for the crisis. The taproot of the trouble is NATO enlargement, the central element of a larger strategy to move Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and integrate into the West. I mean, there's also an article, March 1st in New Yorker, and they mention in that. Mm-hmm. One other thing I will also like to bring it up is, it was not just China and India, there's also Pakistan who abstained from that.
Right. Well,
that's about, and also that 1979 Russia was occupying Afghanistan for many years.
So thank you. So does anyone want to handle that question while we find another one?
Sure. So John Mearsheimer, that you mentioned, is a University of Chicago international relations scholar. Comes from a very particular school in international relations theory, in which he's very skeptical of international organizations. I think we should say that from the start. Like the context of that man's comments, in terms of how he views things, is one of tremendous skepticism of the basis of cooperation in international organizations. So that's where he's coming from in the beginning. I think there's a variation, there's a spectrum of how much NATO expansion can be used to provide an explanation for what's going on. Clearly, it is a variable that matters here. I think there's no way to argue against that. I also think explaining the entirety of the situation and laying it squarely at the feet of NATO expansion misses a kind of the larger context of some of the comments that my colleagues who have studied, have been to the region, who have colleagues there and have been on the ground for decades, I think does a disservice to the idea that there's a broader historical, political, economic, and every other kind of context that should be taken into consideration, is my thought.
And just one other comment on that before we come down here to this question, is that NATO, in Russia, and in Putin's worldview, that NATO is this enemy. And this enemy goes back to 1990, 1991. So when the Soviet Union was collapsing in 1990, 91, there is this belief among Putin, and he propagates it out to Russian people, that there was an agreement not to expand it. And that is something that is highly disputed by scholars and even people who took part in it at the time. And so it's not something that there were conversations between leaders about this concept and what it would mean in the future and what places might be fair game for this and what might not be. But it's not a conclusive answer to this. Putin has taken the perspective that this is simply something he can use as propaganda. It's not that there wasn't a conversation about it and there wasn't some sort of dispute over it or concern over it, certainly 30 years ago, but it is something that Putin has used repeatedly to use NATO as an overt enemy to the Russian people, which I understand why, because you look at the 1949 charter and there's a reason why. I mean, it's not that he's wrong or he's totally off the wall, but the nuance is important because NATO started to expand in the 1990s and into the 2000s rather rapidly, and even early in Putin's time in power, he didn't really protest it quite as much. So this has been, like David said, this is a different, it's part of it, but it's not as simple as that. It may be a way to put it. So
there's one more thing I want to mention real quick. I'm sorry, and I'll stop pontificating at your expense. I think it also bears mention that isn't getting a lot of attention. That what Boris Yeltsin did in terms of privatizing the economy and the creation of oligarchs was clearly at the request of Western institutions and governments. The implementation on a crack, painful way of radical market economics was really ended up hurting the pretense of democracy, ended up hurting a free press and freedom of speech. That those things became subservient to the goals of oligarchs, which then became political goals of Putin. So I think that decision about the privatization of the economy, what was literally called shock and pain. I mean, that was convincing in Russia and the former Soviet Union and in Latin America to undertake these radical market reforms in ways that were poorly thought out and worse, poorly implemented, and led everyone to become extremely skeptical about democracy and about economics because they thought it reinforced what they already said. So I think that's a kind of an underlayment of this other conversation about security that needs to be taken into consideration in my mind.
I agree with that. My first trip to Russia was in 1995, and it was 5,000 rubles to the dollar exchange rate at the time. Right. So.
Might get back to that if there gets going.
So, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm a communications student here, hoping to go into broadcast journalism one day. And so my question is, would you rather have invaded Ukraine if Putin under the Trump or the Biden administration? And my point is why I'm asking this question is why didn't this happen 8 years ago? Why not during the Trump and Pence administration? Why not 20 years from now? Is this just the perfect political climate?
Well, the initial invasion of Ukraine was under the Obama administration, the Obama-Biden administration. And so during the Trump administration, there was no invasion. I don't know if we know the answer to that question necessarily. I did see a couple days ago that John Bolton, a former advisor to President Trump, came out and said, well, if this had happened under President Trump, he was planning to withdraw us from NATO in his second term. That's what John Bolton said 2 or 3 days ago. He was planning on withdrawing us from NATO.
Wow.
Yes, his own advisor, who is a very hawkish foreign policy person, in my view, and he actually said that about 3 days ago.
Yeah. So the answer to that question may be,
I don't know.
the preference would have been Trump's second term is when
Perhaps Trump's second term.
preferred to have gone.
Perhaps. I don't know.
But yeah.
Yes. So go up here and we'll come back down. Go here and then back down here. Go ahead.
Hi. So in the realm of saving face and overall whys of this discussion, why does Russia think that it's worth it to go and gather a bunch of more kilometers when there's globalization and you will have the whole world put sanctions on you, hate you, and hurt your economy really bad? And on top of that, why not put your manpower and womanpower and capital into developing your own country instead of going to war for, again, just a bunch of more kilometers?
I think my view of it is that President Putin has his own rationale. I agree very much with what Professor Goldberg said at the end of his presentation. He's not an irrational actor. He's not crazy or any of that sort of thing, but he has a different rationale for what he's doing. I think there are two things that could answer that question. One is that this will fulfill his sort of ideological goal, and that he thinks that the West will eventually sort of fade away and forget, because we do. And I think he also thinks that these economic sanctions, these economic realities will not last very long, as Professor Goldberg also questioned. Is that how long will all those companies who, in my view, have done the right thing at this moment, how long will that last is a question. And I think he can wait. I think he plays the long game. I think he thinks in the long run this will be worth it to him. But I also think he probably miscalculated the resistance inside of Ukraine. And so now he may be rethinking that. And he may have already done it. It may be on your phone already, and I missed it. So.
But yet, if his original calculation was correct, if they had overrun Ukraine and it was basically over now, then would the West's response be the same? Part of the Western response seems to be, we have a chance. Ukraine still has a chance, and we got to support Ukraine fully. Well, what if it was all over? Would we have the same range of sanctions? Maybe.
My question on that too is, my thought going forward in the next weeks is, when and if the capital city, Kiev, falls to the Russians, what then? Because that's a moment where I think President Putin could declare victory and try to negotiate differently because the capital city has been conquered. I mean, so there's all these sort of geopolitical strategy sort of things, but I think that that's why he's trying to position himself to a position of strength in order then to negotiate, I think, in some way. So, do you have any thoughts on that? Or?
I would just say, since we don't know what the end game is for Moscow, it makes it, very difficult.
Yeah. Go right here.
So I think that this whole thing is there's thousands of questions I like to ask, but, like in the early 1900s, we saw the Bolsheviks and, how they walked on the palace and took the country back because the people were sick of, what the czars were doing. So right now we see more people than ever, I think, protesting in, all over Russia, not just, the capital city where there would be, you could see that happening more. But I think Putin is farther away from his people than ever, kind of, and that maybe I guess my question is, is there a chance of the people kind of revolting against him in this scenario because the sanctions are so tough on them?
I think publicly trumpeting a regime change as an objective of any Western government's policy has not served us well in the past 25 years.
Without question. I agree. And I think the people who are protesting in Russia are very brave for what they're undertaking, because the laws have become more severe for this, and we'll see how those penalties will be actually given out. But I also think that President Putin himself doesn't probably care that much about that necessarily, and he's pretty well insulated. Anyway, he's pretty well insulated from the public, and so yeah.
But you're interesting. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
But like you said, the whole Gaddafi thing, like that's his fear.
Yeah.
Well, this could actually happen, I guess, in a way.
I think he's built a fortress around himself in a variety of ways, economically and actually physically. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much. I think we've all learned a tremendous amount. I do have a question for Estonia and Latvia you mentioned, and what is the stance from Lithuania?
Yeah, Lithuania is also a member of NATO, so that's a consideration. But Lithuania never received as many Russian migrants as Estonia and Latvia did. So the percentage of Russians who are there is smaller. Russian enclaves are less common. So the move would definitely be more to Estonia and Latvia than to Lithuania.
And if you go back a bit into the late 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s, as the Soviet Union was under pressure from ethnic groups, the Lithuanians were at the forefront of this, at the forefront of resisting Soviet rule. And it would seem harder. It's harder for them to, like Professor Quam says, it'd be a steeper hill for Russia to climb on that, I think, with Lithuania. So.
And curiously, in Estonia and Latvia, yes, more Russians live there, but most of them consider they actually have a better quality of life in Estonia and Latvia than they would in Russia. So there's not a lot of clamoring from them to have Russia come and take them.
So maybe, down here somewhere. What can we do her right here? Why don't you go ahead, and then we'll go up there. You go ahead first.
Okay. As you mentioned earlier, you mentioned about how Putin is thinking of long term, the long game, and trying to see what he'll get in the long term. I was just looking it up just now. I don't know very much about this, about like Putin's health in question. And you mentioned that he's going to be turning 70 this fall, so he's not a spring chicken anymore. So, have there been any? Have there been any news or talks about what will happen after he passes away? Because if he let's say he does successfully take over all these countries that was mentioned earlier in the presentation, who's going to who would take after him? Is there someone that's close to him where people have talked about whether they might take after him to maintain that? How would that be maintained if Putin, he's not 30 years old, he doesn't have I highly doubt he has 50 years left, if I'm being honest.
Oh.
That'd be a miracle. So I'm wondering what your guys' opinions on that are.
So I'm definitely dodging your question specifically because of my absence of understanding of the internal dynamics of Russian politics. I would say...
I love my grandpa.
I'm sorry?
I love my grandpa.
To what extent is this a legacy move for Putin? I think my larger concern is around the world, when I keep talking about nationalism and populism, when you have all power is centered in individuals instead of institutions, those individuals disappear, presumably they're mortal, right? Then you have a problem. Then you have a power vacuum, and that's when lots of people lose their lives, and when there's lots of chaos and instability, when there's a power vacuum. So I do not know. The little that I do understand is that there's not a clear line of succession. And we could mention easily a lot of other countries, perhaps not as significant as Russia, that have a similar problem. Vesting power in strongmen is a recipe for instability, and vesting power in institutions is something better. That's not about democracy, that's not about market economics, it's simply saying when one person gets to decide everything that happens within a country, that's a problem if you're a neighbor.
So reading the tea leaves behind Putin is difficult because we don't know who it is. So some people might think somebody like Dmitry Medvedev, who was the president for the 4 years in this time period, might be somebody, but I'm not sure he's necessarily at the top of the heap anymore. He recently resigned from his position. So I don't really think we know, is there somebody behind him? But this goes back 30 years. So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Boris Yeltsin will win he already was the president of the Russian Republic, and he wins an election to be the president of the new Russian state. He serves 2 terms fairly corruptedly as the president of Russia. Not horribly, but a little bit. But the way he left power in 1999 and 2000 sort of sets them up for no process of secession. And they do have elections, but they're not exactly the best elections in the world. And so, so you have a 30-year now pattern, post-Soviet pattern in Russia that's not building this belief in democratic institutions. And so
And it's not only post-Soviet, right? What happened when Lenin died? Who was going to be the next? That took a while to figure out.
Right.
What happened when Stalin died? There was no automatic successor.
Right.
And now we've got Putin, who's acting like a czar, which brings it back even before that. What happened when the czars died? Well, it would be the son. Does Putin have a son?
He has 2 daughters.
2 daughters, that's right. And where are they? Very far in the background.
Far away.
They're not gonna. It's not gonna be succession by family. So yeah, who is it gonna be?
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I just had a question regarding refugees. So this just occurred to me as you were talking about Hungary, taking a really strong stance against accepting Syrian refugees, and other European countries also being hostile to those refugees. And now, here they are accepting Ukrainian refugees with open arms. And so I'm just wondering, does this set the stage for Europe to think about refugees differently, because the bulk of refugees coming from Ukraine are white? And does that have an impact on, how accepting they are? Or is it just the current conditions that make them more accepting of the refugees?
I think the EU High Commission on Refugees has been unwavering. They were very critical of Hungary. There have been discussions about what actions have been taken against Hungary for what has taken place with Fortress Hungary. So I am not unsympathetic to the idea that a country of origin and or ethnicity and race and religion play a role in this, for sure. I don't think it's the EU that turned against its own principles. I think it's individual countries and political leaders who did so for self-serving short-term political interests.
Yeah, I think that's the elephant in the room on this, is that 2 million Ukrainians crossed the border in 2 weeks, but the Syrians couldn't go into certain places. So I think it's the sort of obvious elephant in the room, that there's a cultural, racial, ethnic, religious question that, it's not a question. So we gotta keep going. Up top.
So what makes an oligarch? That is to say, what differentiates an oligarch from the Western bourgeoisie? I'm sorry if this is beyond the scope of Ukraine, but
from a Western what?
From the Western owning class.
We have our 1% too, but we don't have an oligarchy.
Most of these people that we consider to be oligarchs tended to be built in this rather quick transfer of state assets into private assets, and so. You see it in lots of the biggest industries in Russia today, but also other parts of the former Soviet Union. And so these are people that didn't necessarily work in a company. If you think about somebody like Jeff Bezos as an example, he founded Amazon 30 years ago and sort of worked the thing. They did this. One indication that you can see that there's a kind of real problem with the way they function is that in the oil industry in particular. So we have these companies like Rosneft and the other ones that when BP and Exxon and Shell and other companies have pulled out, it has a dramatic impact because they've never fully developed the companies on their own. So these are not people that are developing a company as a business person, which is in the West. So they rely very heavily on Western technology to extract the oil, as an example, out of some very difficult places geographically in Russia, which Siberia. It's very hard to get it out. It's very expensive. And so when BP was the first major oil company to pull out last week, that when they take their $25 billion out of that reality, that's a lot of technology they're taking out. They're taking out the technological ability to extract the oil, and that's the point in many ways, at least in the short term. So that'd be my view of it. But also the oligarchs. One of the things too that I kind of always, when I was preparing for this, it always sort of strikes me that kind of goes under the radar, is that Putin's irritation, I agree with Professor Goldberg that Putin's irritation with the EU might be higher than NATO in some ways. And this is because at the top level of the Russian economic system, back to your oligarch question, it doesn't run legally, right? And if you want to run in the EU, you have to run legally. There are laws you have to follow. This has always been a perplexing, a 1,000-year problem in Russian history. Do you want to hear the whole story? It's fascinating. So no, I'm just kidding. But it's a fascinating story about how the sense of legality is always sort of in question. It's always sort of this, I can remember being there in the 90s and people would ask, an executive from Coca-Cola, are you worried about Yeltsin nationalizing your bottling plant in St. Petersburg? And that's the game that they can't run in because the EU has rules. And the EU has rules and laws that they run by, and they can't play in that sandbox because they're not doing that. It's pretty simple, actually, in some ways, to me at least. But yeah. Question down here. Go ahead.
Thank you. It's a 3 different questions. I'll just put them there. My first is this a proxy war between the United States and Russia? My second one is, did our government fail diplomacy level? And the third one is, well, we attacked Iraq in 1991. And then we attacked Iraq in 2003, but that was in 2003 was a bad intelligence. They said they have WMD, which they didn't have. And I'm anti-war person, and I'm sure many are here. I'm very anti-war. As a matter of fact, my son-in-law is Ukrainian, half Ukrainian, and when I see those images in Ukraine, I was like, so for me, it's like, doesn't matter where it is, east, west, wherever there is war, it's like, it quenches my heart. So we are quick to attack the weaker countries. Why did America not go and attack Russia and says, I'll bomb you, why are you hurting my friend? Thank you.
David?
The first question, well, was this a failure of diplomacy? I mean, I would say that I think the fact that the EU is playing a lead role on this and the United States seems to be playing a secondary role on some of these issues, or at least a partnership, is a positive thing. I think some of these other examples, some of which you mentioned, didn't turn out so well, and I would probably put those examples that you mentioned in there as well. So I don't see this as a failure of diplomacy so far. I think that it's clear that President Putin, this is what he's wanted to do all along. What was the first question?
It's a proxy war.
Oh, proxy war. I don't see the proxy, because this is Russia and the United States are clearly this. I don't view this as a proxy war in the sense that we think about Saudi and Yemen being a civil war about Iran and Saudi Arabia, right? There are other real examples of, to my mind, proxy wars that are unfolding, and this doesn't fall into that. This is more like the Lend-Lease Act, where the United States is providing information. I think they're providing weapons and equipment. I don't think that the United States or Russia has it in their interest to engage in a direct military conflict that escalates into a nuclear exchange. I don't see how anybody wins. I've heard some discussion about Russia using some kind of tactical nuclear device in a city. Just one story about that. I don't know how much veracity to put into that. I don't think that that's what anybody wants. If Putin's goal is to weaken these institutions in Western Europe and retake some of these borders, he can't do that. You see Chernobyl, where you can't have agriculture there. You can't. It's not a place where people can live. So if you actually have a megaton warhead that makes Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like a firecracker, you can't live and work in Europe for thousands of years. That's not a W for Putin. That's not a W for Biden. That's not a W for Brussels. So I don't think it's a proxy war, and I don't think that the United States is going to invade Russia. And I think the United States putting troops on the ground and military equipment closer, can't get any closer to Ukraine than it already is, that's an escalation that we're still a little bit a ways from. I'm not willing to put days, weeks, hours on that, because I don't have any idea, but I think we're still a ways away from that. We have to see what happens in major cities. We have to see closer to what his end game is, what Belarus does, what Poland does, and where these things lead, and how they respond to that. So more pieces have to come into play, I think, before we actually think about a kind of a post-Cold War, major superpower conflict on the ground in Europe. I hope.
My view of that is that there are two reasons why the United States has never attacked Russia. To quote Professor Quam, Russia is huge. And other people have tried this in the past, some Napoleon guy and Hitler, and some, I don't know. And so it doesn't work. So first of all, talk about an impossible task first. And second of all, it's just nuclear weapons, that there's this rattling of that saber, and Putin has talked about it. Would he use them is up in the air, but that's something that is a deterrent to us to get more directly involved, without question. So, down here.
3 questions on the current boundaries of Ukraine. When were they drawn? How were they drawn? And how has Putin now come to dispute the boundaries?
Well, Ukraine was the inherited territory from the Soviet days when it was a republic. So basically, those borders were sent over, just an inheritance. But those borders features had changed over time. Crimea itself was at one point a piece of Russia. And Khrushchev, shortly after the death of Stalin, when Khrushchev took over, one of his first things was he gave Crimea to Ukraine as a gesture of goodwill. So that is part of the history of Crimea and makes it a little bit easier for Putin to say, well, you know, it used to be part of Russia and there's so many Russians there, so we really need to take it back. To go back before the Soviet Union, back in the Tsarist days, then there's a lot of fluctuation as to what was in the Russian Empire, what wasn't the Russian Empire. And if you go back far enough, Kyiv was the focal point, the main city of this fledgling area called Rus. So there's a long history of changes, but most recently it was just really an inheritance from the Soviet border.
I think Putin is challenging it not based on the national boundaries. He's challenging it based on the ethnic identity inside of this. And that ethnic identity is shaped by two factors. One is a Tsarist factor, where under the Tsars, they actually did a Russification effort, which is not a positive term, by the way, where they sent Russians out to live among the non-Russians, and that continued in Soviet times. And so that's why you have these pockets of population, of Russian ethnic population, in all these non-Russian areas of the Soviet Union, somewhere between 10% in some places up to 20 or 30%, 30 years ago when the Soviet Union collapsed. That's changed over time since then. But he looks at Donetsk and Luhansk in that sort of way, saying, well, these are our enclaves, and Transnistria, and these, so there's little pieces all over the place that he can point to and say they're mostly Russian. And so he's not wrong. That's where Russians ethnically live. What those people really want to do, I don't know if we know.
I don't know enough about it, but back in the early days of the Soviet Union, in the 20s, whenever Ukraine was drawn, why, see these contested areas, why were the contested areas just drawn into Russia? Why did it become contested now?
Well, they've been contested. Well, that's a harder question. Yeah. I don't like hard questions. Oh my God, how do you answer that question?
I can't answer that, so I would defer to you. But I have a point about state sovereignty, which Russia and China, as most other major powers in the world, take state sovereignty very, very seriously to their own self-serving interests. I think this is ultimately what's going to make it diplomatically difficult for countries in the developing world, in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia to continue to support this. Because part of the reason why China takes the role that it does is because they don't want people asking uncomfortable questions about Uyghur or Myanmar, where there are Chinese fingerprints involved in human rights violations. So once you take the Chinese position, which is, this is an sovereignty, state sovereignty is airtight, you don't get to mess with it. And here's Putin saying, well, it's a bit more of a flexible understanding of state sovereignty, right? Whereas Chechnya was more about maintaining the Russian Federation and these other things. Once states like Russia begin to disassemble the notion of sovereignty, they're opening up both their relations with allies in the developing world, but also in the neighborhood, I think they're opening themselves up for problems. I'm sorry, I'm not qualified to answer your actual question.
It's a long, complicated question with Ukraine. Because Ukraine was incorporated into the Russian Empire in the 18th century. And so the territory that was incorporated in the 18th century was done by violence, by war. But that territory in the 18th century is not the territory that we see today. It's different. It changes, as Professor Quam said. It changes in its actual exact borders. And so what you find is by the early 20th century, when under Stalin they began to create these 15 republics based on this ethnic identity, as Professor Quam said, is that it was not necessarily, one of the goals of the Soviet Union was to sort of diminish or minimize sort of ethnic identity. They're trying to promote the ideological sort of view of the Great Soviet Revolution, and that's not ethnic or national. It's ideological, and so that wasn't necessarily as hot of a topic, except that Ukraine, after the Russian Revolution, did try to achieve independence. It was put down by the Soviet authorities, so reincorporated back in. And then there was a famine in the 30s that was basically enforced by Stalin onto Ukraine, where about 4 million people died. So it has a long sort of tragic history of being incorporated. But the borders themselves and this idea of being regionally independent kind of comes and goes in intensity over time, is the best way to put it. It's not always intensely like we have to be separate. It kind of comes and goes, depending on what's kind of happening. It's hard to explain.
The history and the politics of Soviet ethnic regions and Soviet ethnic policy is a big topic and is really quite interesting. The second thing I would note is that it wasn't just Russian Empire to Soviet Union overnight when the Russian Revolution happens. There's a civil war that takes place afterwards. Pieces are added afterwards, and so that's a long answer as well.